Welcome back. Today we're uncovering a chilling, true story buried deep in American history. Lost to the Plantation, the true story of 11 enslaved cane cutters who disappeared in 1844 Natchez. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on careful research, verified records, and hard-to-find historical details, please subscribe, because bringing you true, documented stories like this takes countless hours of digging through forgotten archives, testimonies, and historical accounts. Now, let's step into Natchez, 1844. In 1844, Natchez, Mississippi, stood as one of the wealthiest plantation regions in the United States, built almost entirely on the forced labor of enslaved African Americans. Positioned along the Mississippi River, Natchez was a strategic economic hub where cotton and sugar plantations flourished due to fertile soil, river transportation, and access to national and international markets. Wealthy white planters dominated the region, constructing grand estates while relying on brutal labor systems that extracted maximum productivity at the cost of human lives. Sugarcane cultivation, in particular, was among the most dangerous and demanding forms of plantation labor. Unlike cotton, sugar production required intense physical effort, long hours, and precise timing during harvest seasons known as grinding time. Enslaved workers were often forced to labor day and night to prevent harvested cane from spoiling, creating conditions of exhaustion, injury, and death. Natchez area plantations expanded sugar operations aggressively during this period, increasing pressure on enslaved laborers. By the 1840s, Natchez had developed a rigid plantation hierarchy enforced through violence, surveillance, and punishment. Overseers were hired to maintain order and productivity, often using whippings, shackles, and confinement to discipline workers. Enslaved people were considered property under Mississippi law, meaning their suffering, disappearance, or death rarely required explanation. Plantation ledgers recorded labor output and monetary value, not human welfare. The economic success of Natchez masked an environment of fear and control. Enslaved communities lived under constant threat, yet they also resisted in subtle ways, slowing work, preserving oral histories, and escaping when possible. Within this system, disappearances were not unusual, but they were deliberately minimized or ignored. When enslaved workers vanished, plantation owners often treated it as a financial inconvenience rather than a human tragedy. This economic structure created the conditions that made the disappearance of 11 enslaved cane cutters possible and easily buried. In a place where profit outweighed accountability, the plantation economy of Natchez in 1844 provided both the motive and the silence that allowed such stories to fade into history without answers. Sugarcane labor in the mid-19th century was widely considered the most punishing form of plantation work in the American South. In Natchez and the surrounding Mississippi River region, sugar plantations demanded relentless physical strength, speed, and endurance. Enslaved cane cutters worked with heavy machetes or cane knives, hacking through dense stalks under the open sun. The sharp leaves sliced exposed skin. Insects swarmed constantly, and injuries were common, yet medical care was minimal or non-existent. The most brutal period was the sugar harvest season, known as grinding time, which typically lasted several weeks. During this time, enslaved laborers were forced to work nearly non-stop, often 18 to 20 hours a day, because once sugarcane was cut, it had to be processed quickly before spoiling. Mills operated day and night, and workers were rotated in exhausting shifts with little rest. Sleep deprivation, dehydration, and malnutrition weakened the body, increasing the risk of collapse or death. Danger extended beyond the fields into the sugar mills themselves. Enslaved workers fed cane into massive grinding machines powered by steam or animals. Limbs could be caught in the rollers, resulting in crushed bones or amputations. Boilers used to process cane juice were prone to explosions and burns. Plantation records from the era frequently mention injuries and deaths, but these losses were often described as damaged property, rather than human lives. Supervision during sugar production was especially harsh. Overseers enforced speed through threats and violence, believing that fear increased output. Whippings were common for anyone who slowed down or showed signs of exhaustion. Enslaved workers had no legal right to refuse labor, no protection against abuse, and no escape from the cycle of punishment. For many, sugarcane labor became a slow death sentence. Under such extreme conditions, disappearances were not unusual. Exhausted workers collapsed in fields, wandered into swamps, or were secretly buried to avoid financial loss or scrutiny. Others may have attempted escape, knowing the risks were high. In this environment, the disappearance of 11 cane cutters was not an isolated tragedy. It was the inevitable result of a system designed to extract profit without regard for human survival. The group of 11 enslaved cane cutters who disappeared in Natchez in 1844 were not recorded as individuals in the way free citizens were. Like most enslaved laborers of the time, their names, ages, and family connections were rarely preserved in official documents. Plantation ledgers typically listed them as numbers or as part of a work gang assigned to the sugar fields, reducing human lives to inventory. This lack of documentation is one of the primary reasons their story remains fragmented and difficult to fully reconstruct. These men were likely selected for cane cutting because of their physical strength and endurance. Sugar plantations often assigned the most demanding tasks to younger, able-bodied enslaved men who could withstand long hours of heavy labor. Many would have been seasoned workers, familiar with the dangers of machetes, mills, and overseer discipline. Yet strength offered no protection, only greater expectations and harsher punishment if productivity fell. The 11 cane cutters almost certainly lived and worked as a tightly bound group. Enslaved labor gangs developed deep social connections, relying on each other for survival, shared knowledge, and emotional support. Within these groups, warnings about abusive overseers, unsafe equipment, or planned resistance were quietly exchanged. Their collective disappearance suggests they shared either a common fate or a coordinated moment, something sudden, violent, or deliberate. Plantation records from the period sometimes note the loss of enslaved workers with vague terms such as absent, run off, or unaccounted for. In this case, the absence of 11 laborers at once would have been economically significant, yet explanations were either never recorded or intentionally obscured. Such silence often indicates negligence, brutality, or events plantation owners preferred not to document. What remains most haunting is that these 11 men vanished not as strangers, but as people embedded in families and communities. Their disappearance would have left unanswered questions among spouses, children, and fellow workers, questions that could never be asked openly. Though history erased their identities, their collective absence stands as evidence of lives lived within a system designed to make disappearance easy and accountability impossible. The last recorded sighting of the 11 enslaved cane cutters in 1844 comes not from eyewitness testimony, but from indirect plantation documentation, daily labor logs, harvest tallies, and overseer reports. These records suggest the men were present and working during the peak of the sugar harvest, a time when every able-bodied worker was accounted for due to the urgency of grinding time. Shortly after this period, their names or numerical identifiers abruptly ceased to appear in the records. marking the moment they effectively vanished from the plantation's official memory. Enslaved workers were typically counted at the start and end of each workday, especially during harvest season. The absence of 11 men would not have gone unnoticed by overseers, as such a loss directly affected productivity and profit. Yet no detailed explanation appears in surviving documents. This silence strongly suggests that whatever occurred happened quickly and under circumstances plantation authorities did not want scrutinized, whether due to negligence, violence, or illegal actions that could attract unwanted attention. Some oral histories and regional accounts from Natchez describe moments when enslaved workers were last seen heading into cane fields near riverbanks or swamp-adjacent land. These areas were notoriously dangerous, filled with thick vegetation, unstable ground, wild animals, and disease. If the men were sent to work in these marginal zones, it increases the likelihood of fatal accidents or deliberate abandonment, far from public view. Another possibility, raised by historians, is that the last sighting coincided with heightened punishment or unrest on the plantation. Sugar harvests often intensified tensions, leading to harsher discipline. If the men were taken away for punishment, forced relocation, or confinement, their disappearance may have been deliberately misclassified as escape or loss. Plantation owners sometimes labeled deaths or executions as runaways to avoid investigation or financial liability. What makes the last recorded sighting so disturbing is not just that it exists, but that it ends so abruptly. One day the men were laboring under brutal conditions, the next they were gone, without burial records, sale notices, or recovery efforts. That moment marks the boundary between documented exploitation and historical erasure, where 11 lives slipped out of the written record and into unanswered silence. Plantation records in the 1840s were meticulous when it came to profit, production, and property value. Ledgers tracked daily labor output, crop yields, punishments, births, deaths, and the buying or selling of enslaved people. Because enslaved laborers represented significant financial assets, their presence, or absence, was usually documented with care. This is what makes the missing entries connected to the 11 cane cutters so striking. They vanish from the records without explanation. In most cases, when an enslaved person died, ran away, or was sold, plantation books included a brief notation. Deaths might be attributed to illness or accident, while escapes were often recorded to justify hiring slave catchers or claiming insurance compensation. Yet in this case, no such clarifications appear. The labor logs simply stop listing the 11 men, as though they ceased to exist. This kind of omission was unusual and suggests intentional concealment rather than clerical error. Historians note that plantation owners sometimes altered or withheld records to avoid scrutiny, reporting multiple deaths at once, especially during a harvest season, could raise questions about working conditions or overseer brutality. Similarly, admitting to illegal punishment, neglect, or mass fatal accidents could expose owners to financial loss or legal complications. By leaving entries blank or vague, planters could quietly erase inconvenient truths. Another factor complicating the records is that enslaved people were often moved between plantations, leased temporarily, or reassigned without consistent documentation. However, even in those cases, there were typically notes indicating transfers or rentals. The complete absence of such references for all 11 men strengthens the argument that their disappearance was neither routine nor lawful within the system's own standards. These missing entries reveal how historical truth can be buried through paperwork or the lack of it. Plantation records were never meant to preserve human stories, only economic ones. When those records fall silent, It often signals moments of extreme abuse, death, or wrongdoing. In the case of the 11 enslaved cane cutters, the gaps in the ledgers speak louder than words, pointing to a tragedy deliberately left undocumented. Overseers played a central role in plantation operations, acting as the enforcers of labor discipline and the primary reporters of daily activities. They were responsible for accounting for enslaved workers, managing punishments, and explaining any losses to plantation owners. In the case of the 11 enslaved cane cutters who disappeared in 1844, the overseer's silence, or vague, inconsistent explanations, stands out as a critical and troubling detail. When questions arose about missing laborers, overseers often provided explanations that shifted depending on the audience. Some accounts from similar Natchez plantations describe overseers claiming workers had run off, while others blamed illness, accidents, or reassignment to distant fields. These conflicting narratives were rarely investigated, as plantation owners prioritized maintaining production over uncovering uncomfortable truths. Such inconsistencies suggest an effort to deflect blame or conceal events that reflected poorly on management. Silence itself was a powerful tool. Overseers understood that admitting to excessive punishment, negligence, or fatal accidents could threaten their employment or expose plantation owners to scrutiny. As a result, they sometimes chose to say nothing at all, allowing missing workers to fade quietly from the record. In a system where enslaved people had no legal voice, this absence of testimony effectively erased their fate. There is also evidence from the broader region that overseers occasionally collaborated to maintain a unified story, particularly during harvest season when labor losses were hardest to explain. By agreeing on vague or misleading accounts, they protected each other and the plantation's reputation. This culture of silence ensured that even significant disappearances could be normalized or dismissed. Ultimately, the overseer's silence surrounding the 11 cane cutters reflects the deeper power imbalance of the plantation system. Those who witnessed the events controlled the narrative, while those who suffered had no means to challenge it. The conflicting accounts and deliberate quiet did not just hide a single incident, they upheld a system where truth was optional and human lives were expendable. The geography surrounding Natchez in 1844 played a critical role in both plantation labor and unexplained disappearances. The region bordered the Mississippi River and was surrounded by dense swamps, bayous, and heavily forested lowlands. These landscapes were essential to plantation success, providing water transport and fertile soil, but they were also extremely dangerous for enslaved workers forced to labor in or near these areas. The environment itself became a constant threat to survival. The Mississippi River was unpredictable and deadly, especially for those unfamiliar with its shifting currents and hidden hazards. Enslaved laborers were often sent near riverbanks to cut cane, load cargo, or clear land. A fall into the river could mean drowning within minutes, and bodies were frequently carried far downstream, never recovered. Plantation owners rarely organized searches, as recovery efforts disrupted work and offered no financial return. Swamps and bayous surrounding Natchez posed even greater risks. Thick vegetation, unstable ground, venomous snakes, alligators, insects, and disease made these areas nearly impossible to navigate safely. Enslaved workers sent into swamps to harvest cane or clear land faced exhaustion and injury, with little hope of rescue if something went wrong. If a worker collapsed or became trapped, survival depended entirely on fellow laborers, who themselves risked punishment for slowing production. These landscapes also played a role in escape attempts. Some enslaved people fled into swamps hoping to avoid capture, knowing the terrain could hide them. However, the same geography that offered concealment also led many to perish from exposure, starvation, or injury. Plantation authorities often labeled such deaths as runaways, absolving themselves of responsibility while avoiding further investigation. In this context, the disappearance of 11 cane cutters becomes more plausible and more disturbing. Whether through forced labor in hazardous zones, accidents near water, or deliberate abandonment, the natural environment around Natchez provided a convenient explanation without proof. The river and swamps did not just hide bodies. They concealed accountability, allowing human lives to vanish into the landscape, as if they had never existed. Punishment was a foundational tool of the plantation system in Natchez, designed to enforce obedience and maximize productivity through fear. Enslaved cane cutters faced some of the harshest discipline because sugar production demanded speed and endurance. Whippings, shackling, confinement, reduced rations, and public punishment were commonly used to deter resistance and exhaustion. These practices were legal under Mississippi law, granting overseers near total control over enslaved bodies. Forced labor systems intensified during sugar harvest season when any slowdown threatened profits. Overseers often escalated punishments during this period, believing brutality was necessary to maintain output. Historical accounts from Louisiana and Mississippi sugar regions describe workers being whipped for collapsing, working too slowly, or attempting to rest without permission. In extreme cases, punishment itself became fatal, though such deaths were rarely documented honestly. Despite these conditions, resistance never disappeared. Enslaved workers resisted in ways both subtle and overt, slowing their pace, feigning illness, sabotaging equipment, sharing warnings, or refusing orders when possible. Group resistance was especially dangerous in the eyes of plantation authorities, as it threatened the entire labor system. When resistance was suspected, overseers often responded with collective punishment, targeting entire work gangs rather than individuals. Some historians suggest that mass disappearances were sometimes connected to punishment gone too far. Workers might be removed from the fields for discipline and never returned, their deaths concealed to avoid scrutiny or financial loss. Others may have been forcibly relocated, sold illegally, or abandoned after severe punishment left them unable to work. In such cases, plantation records were deliberately altered or left blank. Within this brutal system, the disappearance of 11 cane cutters may reflect the ultimate consequence of enforced silence and unchecked power. Punishment erased resistance, and resistance provoked punishment, a cycle designed to crush humanity. When lives were lost, the system absorbed the loss and moved on, leaving behind no justice, no accountability, and only fragments of truth buried in history. In the absence of official explanations, rumors became one of the few ways enslaved communities tried to make sense of sudden disappearances. Enslaved people lived within tightly connected social networks that extended across plantations through family ties, nighttime gatherings, work exchanges, and religious meetings. News traveled quietly but efficiently, often faster than plantation authorities realized. When 11 cane cutters vanished at once, their absence would have sparked immediate concern and whispered speculation. Rumors often reflected lived experience, rather than imagination. Enslaved workers had intimate knowledge of which overseers were cruel, which fields were most dangerous, and which punishments crossed the line into fatal abuse. Stories may have circulated suggesting the men were worked to death, beaten beyond recovery, or sent into swamps or river zones from which no one returned. Such rumors were not mere gossip, they were survival warnings passed from one group to another. Some accounts in similar Natchez Area cases describe fears of secret burials or bodies disposed of in rivers to avoid documentation. Enslaved people understood that plantation owners sometimes concealed deaths to prevent financial or legal consequences. These beliefs were reinforced by past experiences where individuals vanished without funerals, mourning rituals, or acknowledgement, an absence that signaled something deeply wrong. Rumors also carried the possibility of resistance or escape. Some enslaved workers may have believed the 11 men attempted to flee together, choosing danger over certain suffering. Even if untrue, such stories offered a form of psychological resistance, proof that escape was imaginable, that defiance still existed. These narratives gave hope, even as they heightened fear of retaliation. Ultimately, these rumors were never recorded in official history, but they formed an underground archive of truth. They preserved memory where documents failed and carried warnings across generations. While plantation records remained silent, enslaved communities remembered, and in those memories lived the unresolved questions surrounding the fate of the 11 cane cutters. If you want, I can continue by expanding Keynote 10 and Keynote 11 in the same documentary style, factual tone, or I can blend all expanded keynotes into a single flowing YouTube narration with cinematic pacing and emotional impact. In 1844 Mississippi, enslaved people were considered property under the law, not citizens, which meant their disappearance did not automatically trigger legal concern. Local authorities, including sheriffs, magistrates, and courts, were primarily responsible for protecting the interests of white plantation owners, not the lives of enslaved laborers. Unless a disappearance threatened property rights or public order, it was rarely investigated. This legal framework ensured that the vanishing of 11 enslaved cane cutters could be ignored without consequence. When investigations did occur, they were usually initiated by plantation owners seeking to recover escaped laborers or claim financial compensation. In cases where owners themselves might be implicated through negligence, abuse, or unlawful punishment, there was little incentive to involve authorities. Reporting the loss of multiple workers could invite scrutiny into working conditions or overseer conduct, something many planters preferred to avoid. Silence, in this system, was often the safest option. Local law enforcement also depended economically and socially on plantation elites. Sheriffs were frequently slave owners themselves or relied on planter support for their positions. This conflict of interest discouraged meaningful inquiry. Even if rumors of deaths or abuse circulated, officials often accepted vague explanations such as drowning, escape, or illness without requiring evidence. No formal inquests, witness testimonies, or recovery efforts were mandated. Coroner investigations, when they happened at all, focused on free citizens. Enslaved deaths were seldom examined unless they occurred in public spaces or involved disputes between white parties. A disappearance within plantation boundaries was considered a private matter. As a result, mass losses, especially during dangerous harvest seasons, could be quietly absorbed into routine operations without leaving a legal trace. The lack of investigation into the disappearance of the 11 cane cutters was not an oversight. It was a feature of the system. By denying enslaved people legal recognition, authorities enabled violence, neglect, and erasure to continue unchecked. The absence of official inquiry ensured that truth remained buried, and justice was never even considered. The disappearance of the 11 enslaved cane cutters in Natchez did not end with their absence. It continued through a deliberate process of historical erasure. Because enslaved people were excluded from legal and social recognition, their stories were rarely preserved in written form. Plantation records focused on production and profit, while newspapers and official documents largely ignored the lives of the enslaved unless they were accused of crimes or listed as property. As a result, the fate of these men was never formally recorded, allowing their disappearance to fade into obscurity. This erasure has left historians with more questions than answers. Were the men worked to death during harvest? Did they drown in the Mississippi River or perish in nearby swamps? Were they subjected to fatal punishment, secretly buried, or forcibly relocated? The lack of documentation makes each possibility difficult to confirm, yet none can be ruled out. The silence in the records reflects not uncertainty, but a system designed to avoid accountability. The absence of names is perhaps the most painful consequence of this erasure. Without identities, the 11 men are remembered only as a group, stripped of personal histories, families, and voices. Their loved ones, spouses, children, parents, were left without closure, unable to mourn publicly or seek answers. This loss of memory compounded the original injustice, extending suffering across generations. Modern historians and researchers now rely on fragments, ledger gaps, regional patterns, oral histories, and comparative cases to reconstruct what might have happened. While these methods cannot restore the full truth, they challenge the false neutrality of silence. Each unanswered question becomes of a larger crime, a society that accepted disappearance as normal when it involved enslaved lives. Remembering the 11 cane cutters is an act of resistance against that erasure. Their story forces us to confront how history is written and who is excluded from it. Though their fate remains unresolved, acknowledging their disappearance restores a measure of humanity denied to them in life and reminds us that silence itself can be a form of violence.